So how does a camel demonstrate that the Bible is not the inerrant word of God, that the information contained in it is not historical? Well, in order to explain that, let me give you a brief history on camels, and then we will move forward and I will demonstrate how the Bible writers got it wrong as far as camels and the Bible, which then makes you wonder about the entire story by which camels are included in. So camels are an animal that were originated in the Americas. And anthropologists believe that camels that were in the Americas before the last ice age migrated across the Bering Strait and into Asia. And then as they migrated from Asia, they moved into the Middle East. But all of this took time. All of this took a lot of time. And the domestication of camels didn't happen in concordance with the stories of the Bible. You see, according to your biblical narratives, camel was very instrumental in the Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac stories. Now we have to understand that the Abrahamic story begins in the middle of the second millennium. So that is around 2300 BCE, quite possibly as late as 1800 BCE. And within these stories and dealing with Abraham, we are told that Abraham sent a servant to travel to find a wife for his son Isaac, and they traveled by camel. We find out that Abraham gained these camels when he told Pharaoh that his wife Sarai was his sister and not his wife, in fear of her being taken and him being killed. And when Pharaoh found this out, he provided her with slaves, silver, gold, a bunch of cattle, and one of those animals named are camels. This is why his servant had a camel to go look for a wife. We're told in the story that with Jacob, while he was working for Laban, he acquired camels. And when Jacob and his wife were his wives, and his primary wife that he loved more, which was Rachel, when she was sitting on the idols of her father's gods, she was sitting on camels. Now, we see these stories involving camels, and of course, most people are going to think, well, that makes sense. There should be camels. Why can't there be camels? Well, the problem comes about for a couple of different points. The first point is that camels are not known to be in Egypt until around 900 to 800 BCE. Most likely not even until 700 BCE, once they were being attacked by the Assyrians and much of their northern Egypt was conquered by the Assyrians, and camels were somewhat introduced by the Assyrians. Later, they were more introduced by the Persians. And then when the Greeks conquered Persia and conquered Egypt, they did not become a primary source of travel and a symbol of wealth until the Ptolemaic dynasty, which did not occur until the 300s BCE. So the camels would not have been available for Pharaoh to give to Abraham during the time frame when he pimped out Sarah to the Pharaoh in order to save his life, and then acquired goods once everything was discovered that that was actually his wife. So now some of you may dig a little bit deeper, and you may come to this video and suggest that, well, there was a type of camel that was available in Mesopotamia, and that being the two-hump camel. Now, yes, towards the end of the third millennium and into the second millennium, two-hump camels were known to be in the Zagros mountain range. But the Zagros mountain range is not necessarily Mesopotamia. The Zagros mountain range is in Iran. So the domesticated camels that came across the Bering Strait into Asia made their way by the third, and by the end of the third and the second and the fullness of the second millennium, into Iran. And from there, they migrated into the Arabian Peninsula and then into Egypt through war. But the first time you actually get the one hump camel domesticated in Israel is not until the 10th century BCE, which is in your 900th BCE. This is why the Assyrians would have had the one hump camel that when they conquered through into Egypt and conquered the Levant itself. But prior to that, you do not have any camels that are in Israel until 900 BCE. So, what does that say about the stories of Abraham? Well, it tells us that these stories were written in and around 400 BCE, which means that they were written at a time frame when a domesticated one hump camel and two hump camels would have been known to the writers. And to those writers, they would not have accounted for the fact that camels hadn't been around at the time frame of Abraham, since they have just experienced or know of the previous 500, maybe 600 years of there being camels domesticated as and identified as a source of wealth within the Levant, Egypt, uh, Saudi Arabia Peninsula area. At that time frame, that's when they knew about camels being a source of wealth. So in writing their story, the camel was included in order for them to get the point across that when this payment was made to Abraham, that for pimping his wife, that he became wealthy, he had a sign of wealth, which is the camel. That when his servant rode off to find a wife, she was riding the servant was riding a camel, a sign of wealth. When Rachel was sitting on the camel, and it was during her cycle, her menstrual cycle, to get her father not to touch the camel or touch her in search for his gods, it was a sign of opulence and wealth that she and Jacob and the rest of the family were riding on camels. This was a sign of wealth. When Jacob gave camels to his brother Esau upon his somewhat return, it was a sign of wealth of him giving those camels to his brother. But the problem is this, that there were no camels in that region at that time. And camels were not seen as a sign of wealth until around 300 BCE in Egypt, and possibly only as early as around 500 BCE in the Middle East. So this demonstrates that the biblical stories, the narratives, are just fictitious stories written to create a history for people that were being oppressed, and now upon their release from the Babylonian captivity by the Persians, that they were writing these stories to give themselves some level of opulence and antiquity within the Mediterranean community. But what it shows us who have deconstructed from the Bible is that the information is not true. If this is the inerrant word of some deity, then everything should fall in place in accordance to history, in accordance to archaeology, and everything else surrounding it. But what we see is that it does not. It fails too many times. It fails too often. And with each one of those failures, it lets us know mentally and intellectually that these stories are not true stories, that these stories are not about a true and actual God, which then allows us to deconstruct our emotions from the attachment that we have from in the indoctrination of this story, of this book, so that we can then become free, and free of the stress, free of the indoctrination, free of the false narratives, and actually be able to start using critical thinking and have emotional detachment from these stories, so that we can truly know and study who we are and dive deep inside of who we are, instead of being what some book and some people who wrote it over 2,000 years ago is trying to tell us who we are. So I hope that this has been educational for you. And always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself, because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibrations.